She thought it was just another long night at the diner until she saw the old woman shivering alone in the storm, abandoned in the freezing rain like she didn't matter at all. Helping her was supposed to be a small act of kindness, but by morning, that kindness would put a target on her back. Because the powerful man who walked through those diner doors wasn't just looking for answers, he was hiding something. Something dark. And what he tells her next will change everything she thought she knew about justice, loyalty, and the world she lives in. So tell me, what would you do if the truth came looking for you? Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And subscribe to Horovia, because tomorrow, I've got something extra special for you. Grace Thompson lived her life in routines hard, exhausting routines that never seemed to let up. Every morning began before sunrise, slipping into her faded diner uniform while her 3-year-old daughter slept in the next room. Every day she pushed through double shifts, smiling at customers who barely looked at her, pretending she didn't notice the whispers or the way some people seemed surprised that a young black woman could carry herself with such quiet pride. The Lexington diner wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even comfortable, but it was steady. Predictable. It kept the lights on and food on the table, even if just barely. Grace had learned to survive in the cracks between bills and overdue notices, in a world where people like her worked twice as hard to be seen half as much. Still, she carried her world with strength, her daughter's drawings tucked into her apron, the soft hum of the late-night rain outside the diner windows, the small hopes she held silently. Life wasn't easy, but it was hers, and as long as she kept moving, kept fighting, she believed things would get better. But on this particular night, something felt different. The storm outside wasn't just weather, it was a warning. The streets were unusually quiet, the neon sign flickering like it was struggling to stay alive. Grace felt a tightness in her chest she couldn't explain, a sense that the routine she depended on was about to crack open. And she was right, because before the rain stopped, before the diner closed, and before she walked home that night, Grace would make a choice that pulled her into a world she never belonged to, one ruled by wealth, secrets, and people who didn't see her as equal. She just didn't know it yet. Rain hammered the diner windows like it was trying to drown the city itself. Grace wiped down the counter for the 5th time, waiting for closing, waiting for silence, waiting for a moment where she could breathe. But that moment never came, because that's when she saw her, an elderly woman, alone in a wheelchair, soaked to the bone under the dying streetlight, her thin arms trembling, her silver hair plastered to her face. Forgotten, abandoned, invisible. Grace didn't think she moved. Out into the storm, pushing through the cold wind as water soaked through her clothes. The woman's voice cracked when she tried to speak, the words barely audible. My son, he was supposed to pick me up. She had called him 3 times. He never answered. Grace felt something she knew too well, a familiar sting, the kind sharpened by a lifetime of being overlooked. She brought the woman inside, warming her with towels, feeding her fresh soup, giving her the dignity she deserved. For a moment, the diner didn't feel like a dying job. It felt like purpose. But peace never lasts long. The next morning, the diner door swung open, and with it came the kind of silence that changes a room. A man stepped inside, tall, sharp suit, eyes like steel. The kind of man who looked at the world like it owed him something. He was the woman's son, a billionaire. A man who seemed more insulted than grateful that his mother had needed help from a waitress. His questions came fast, clipped, assessing her like she was some kind of threat. And then came the envelope money, offered like a bandage for neglect. Grace's anger cracked through everything. She didn't want his money. She wanted accountability for him to understand what it meant to leave someone vulnerable, alone, helpless. But instead of listening, he pressed harder, investigating her, talking down to her, speaking as if being black and poor meant she couldn't possibly understand responsibility. The tension grew. Every word tightened the air. Customers watched. Tony hid behind the kitchen window. Grace stood alone. But when she refused him, truly refused him, something changed in his face. A shift, a realization. Not enough to erase what he'd done, but enough to make him pause. Enough for him to return with an offer that felt unreal. A job in his company. A chance to change her life. A door she wasn't sure she was allowed to walk through. She wanted to throw the idea away. People like her didn't get opportunities like that. Not without a price, not without a fight. And deep down, she knew entering his world meant stepping into a system built to keep women like her at the bottom. But then came the eviction threat. The bills piling up. The fear of failing her daughter. And one more thing, the old woman's eyes, as she was taken away by that cold, sharp-faced caregiver. The fear Grace couldn't forget. Something was wrong in that world. Something darker than neglect. So the night Grace finally called him back, her hands trembling as her phone rang, she didn't realize she wasn't just accepting a job. She was stepping into a place where power had no mercy, and where people like her were never meant to survive. And the first person waiting for her inside wasn't going to welcome her at all. Grace had expected cold stares when she walked into Hayes Corporation, but she wasn't ready for the quiet violence of the place. The elevator doors hadn't even closed before people sized her up. The black girl from the diner, the outsider, the mistake someone important must have made. Whispers followed her down every hallway. Meetings stopped when she entered. Eyes rolled when she spoke. But nothing compared to what happened the day she walked into Maggie's room and found the truth. The elderly woman sat in her chair, hands trembling not from her illness but from fear. Grace knelt beside her, trying to understand. That's when she heard footsteps. Sharp, controlled, dangerous. Victoria, her smile cut like glass. "You weren't assigned to be here today," she said flatly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "You people never stay where you're supposed to." The words hit Grace like a punch. Quiet, coded, but unmistakably racist. A lifetime of microaggressions suddenly sharpened into something uglier, something intentional. Grace stood slowly, her pulse racing. "I'm here because Maggie needed someone who actually cares." Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You think you belong here? You're a waitress. A charity case. Do you really believe William hired you for your skills?" The way she said skills made Grace's skin crawl. But Grace didn't back down. "I know he didn't hire you for your compassion." Seconds stretched. The air tightened. And then Maggie whispered, barely audible, "Grace, don't leave me with her." Everything froze. Victoria's mask cracked just for a moment, and Grace saw it. The control, the intimidation, the twisted power she held over Maggie. Grace moved toward the wheelchair. "I'm taking her out of here." Victoria blocked the door. "No, you're not." For the first time since taking the job, Grace felt real fear. Not for herself, but for Maggie. And when William suddenly appeared behind the glass wall, watching the confrontation unfold, Grace knew everything was about to explode. Because in that moment, he wasn't looking at Victoria. He was looking at Grace, like he finally realized he'd hired her to uncover a truth he wasn't ready to face. When William stepped into that room, time seemed to fracture. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then he saw the fear in his mother's eyes, not confusion, not illness, but fear. And he finally understood what Grace had been trying to show him. Neglect isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, wrapped in professionalism, masked by authority, protected by power. Victoria's control unraveled quickly after that. The investigation that followed exposed years of subtle intimidation, careless treatment disguised as efficiency, emotional manipulation framed as duty. And through it all, Grace stood beside Maggie. Not because it was her job, but because compassion was the one thing no one could strip from her. When it was over, William apologized. Not the polished corporate kind this time. It was human, honest. He asked Grace to stay, to help rebuild the system that had failed his mother and countless others. She accepted. Not for him, but for Maggie, and for every person whose voice had been ignored, because someone decided they didn't matter. But even as Grace stepped into a better future, she knew something deeper. This story wasn't just hers. What happened to Maggie, the fear, the silence, the erasure happens every day to people society pushes to the margins. And what happened to Grace, the doubt, the dismissal, the quiet prejudice was a reminder that racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it wears a suit. Grace didn't just walk into a corporation. She walked into a system that needed to change, and she became part of that change. And now the question becomes yours. How many more Graces and Maggies will be ignored before we decide that compassion isn't optional, that justice begins with paying attention? Before you go, tell us where you're watching from, and if you're new here, subscribe to Horovia for more powerful stories that reveal the truth we can't afford to ignore.